Hello, everyone. We're happy to welcome you back to discuss autism with one of the most influential voices in the global community, Temple Grandin. 4 years ago, we had the privilege of speaking with Temple in an interview that attracted over 14,000 live viewers. Joining me again today is Gustavo Tosi, a psychologist and director of Instituto Ninar here in Brazil, and Dr. Susana Herculano Zell, a renowned Brazilian neuroscientist, who was recently diagnosed on the spectrum. Dr. Herculano's unique perspective as both a scientist and someone on the spectrum adds an invaluable dimension to our discussion today. For those who don't know me, I am Mariana Caminha, your moderator for today's event. And as a mother of an autistic teenage son, I'm deeply committed to understanding and improving the lives of individuals on the spectrum. Today's discussion will be divided in two sections. The first one will be led by Dr. Susana, focusing on neuroscience and an exchange of personal experiences between two people on the spectrum. The second section will explore intervention strategies and how we as a society can be better prepared to embrace neurodiversity on the workforce. So once again, thank you so much for being here. Temple, it's a pleasure to see you again. How are you today?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Dr. Susana, without further ado, this is your first time meeting Temple Grandin, and I'm sure you have so many questions. But before we dive in, could you share with us a little bit about your interest in neuroscience, how it began, and why today's conversation is personally significant for you?
Sure. So I did not always want to be a neuroscientist. I actually didn't even realize that we had a brain while I was graduating in biology. I left Brazil to come to the US to get a degree in genetics. That's what I thought I was going to do. And when I was forced to take rotations in different labs, I kicked and screamed because, just let me do already what I came here to do. And it was a wonderful thing that I had these different opportunities just shoved at me, because that was when I realized that we have a brain. And working with, I've done different things in neuroscience. I got my education first with visual neurophysiology, which is, and from there I went to science communication, and I started doing what I do now, which is comparing brains of different species and figuring out what different brains are made of and what are the rules. As my daughter points out to me, "Oh, mother, what a very autistic thing to want to do. You want to understand the rules of how brains are put together, and you want to know the numbers and how many neurons compose brains of different species and how they compare." And all of that came from realizing from my work with scientific communication with the public that we actually didn't know the first thing about what different brains are made of. What you're still going to find in the textbooks, that the human brain is made of 100 billion neurons and 10 times as many glial cells. That's not true. That was an order of magnitude estimate that got taken for the real thing, and what was, essentially a game of telephone among scientists. So I realized, out of personal difficulties, I was married, and I very obviously needed a divorce because there were these issues with communication that made me I was paralyzed. Every time that an argument started, I did not have words to speak back. And that was when I tried to get my then husband to therapy. Never happened. What ended up happening was that I found therapy, and all because of Steve Silberman's book Neurotribes, which is he died tragically just a blessed month, I think. And that is actually something that I would love to ask Temple if she ever had the opportunity to meet him in person. But his book was a revelation to me, because I read through all the descriptions of the kids that Hans Asperger treated and or cared for. And I started looking at that, and I was like, but I did that. I did this too. Oh my God, this is me as a child. So I started taking notes. My copy of the book has this long, long list of all the things that I remember doing in my childhood, and all these features of myself that I grew up to think they were quirks. I always knew that I was weird compared to other people. I think we go through that phase where we think that, well, but doesn't everybody do this? Doesn't everybody think like this? And it's a shock to realize that no, there's a pattern to what we do and how we think that is exactly what defines the spectrum, even though each person is their own person with their own individual constellation of features. But it struck me then, how can I be a neuroscientist and not be able to recognize all these features in myself on my own? And I think the answer is exactly that. I'm autistic. Part of the features of the spectrum is very little self-awareness. We have a lot of difficulty realizing even that we're mute, at a loss for words at times, or that we don't know what we're feeling, that we don't understand why the person on the other side expects us to understand something or act a certain way, and we obviously can't, because that hasn't been communicated to us. So that was 5 years ago, I think, and ever since, it's been discovery upon discovery or rediscovery. I think I hear that from a lot of people who get the late diagnosis, how liberating it is to understand that there is a diagnosis. You are part of a bigger known pattern. You're not just randomly weird, or you're not faulty in weird ways. And I'm currently even grappling with the concept that we're even faulty really to begin with. I prefer to think right now that we're what I like to call, we're mentally left-handed in a world that is made by the right-handed for the right-handed, right? And it's something that I've learned from my work, is my own research work, is how life is really just, it's whatever works. There's an enormous range of diversity. There's no single way to put a brain together. There's no need for a brain to be this way or that way with this number of neurons or this size. I think brains simply are what they can be, given the genetic inheritance, given the environmental circumstances, given the energetic realities of the world that you grow up in, and how you're educated, what opportunities you are given, that shapes what you become. So what becomes of your biological capabilities, right? I think there's a big difference that we have to remember between what are your biological capabilities and what do you do with them that turns them into your actual abilities. And I think dealing with being autistic, so dealing with being mentally left-handed in this right-handed world, has a lot to do with this experience of shaping one thing into the other. And I think knowing about all of this makes our life much easier for ourselves. But I think drawing awareness from everybody else, from the 90 something percent of the population that lives on the other side, I think it makes life, if not better for everyone, at least much more interesting.
Beautiful, Susanna. And I think one of the most unique features that you, Temple, bring to us is the fact that you are on the spectrum, but also you can explain how you think. It's fascinating to hear how you explain the way you think. So could you give us just a small talk about this, how your mind works in this world that is made for right-hand people?
Well, I'm really into details. I don't think in big generalities. And now in my new latest book, Visual Thinking, I discuss different kinds of ways people with autism think. That also was discussed in The Autistic Brain, which I know has been translated into Portuguese. Now, the thing about the autistic person is they tend to be an extreme visual thinker, or they may be an extreme mathematics mind, and they're actually kind of opposite kinds of thinking. In the HBO movie, everything I think about is a picture. Like I'm thinking about where I'm going to go to lunch and we don't have enough time. Different restaurants open at different times. I've been thinking of this right now. I'm seeing the restaurants and I'm going to have to eat at the food court at school. I won't have time to eat somewhere else. Okay, that's a very simple thing, but it's something I've got a time crunch with a class and I'm going, well, this place doesn't open soon enough so I can drive over to the university. But it's coming up as pictures as I think about it. Then walking from the parking garage to the class. I'm older now, I don't do it quite as quickly. But autistics tend to be, and they might be an extreme visualizer, object visualizer, that's me. But I want to make it very clear, not all autistic people are picture thinkers. There are also some that are extreme mathematics thinkers. And then a third type is an extreme word thinker. These are the kids that love history. They love facts. They'll know all the facts about their favorite football team or soccer team, whatever. It's word-based facts. And where most normal people are mixtures of different kinds of thinking. The other thing is, I never could cared about social chit-chat and things like that. I am what I do. Well, I just read a really awful article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about the GPS systems on airplanes being spoofed. And that's very scary. I fly all the time. They tried to spoof a GPS to make a plane land in the middle of the ocean. I don't like that. There's certain parts of the world that if I ran an airline, I would not fly over because of ground-based transmitters that can get into the plane's navigation system. So I've been thinking about how to fix that. And I was looking up a whole bunch of stuff last night on airplane navigation. But I'm not an expert in electronics. I know some basics. But the way I'm approaching this, let's say I am the government official or our Federal Aviation Association, and I have to make policy decisions about this. And right now we're shutting down the old-fashioned navigation aids. We better not do that.
Right.
We better not do that. The old, what I call them, airplane lighthouses, beacons. I call them VOR towers. I've been looking into, visual cameras. Could planes navigate looking at mountains and roads? Well, I've got a problem. It's called clouds. And just before I tuned into you, I looked up a new radar that can see through clouds. But the problem is it's an active sensor. And a camera is a passive sensor. That cannot be hacked. but an active sensor that puts out a beam to see through the cloud can be hacked. I was just looking at that right now.
So let me ask you something,
These
Temple.
are the kinds of things I find very interesting. And it's something, let's say I'm a policymaker. I have to know, no, we should not shut down the old-fashioned navigation system. And then I found out what mob meant. In other words, they were going to shut them down to the minimum operational network, the old-fashioned system, which is much less prone to hacking. Yes, this has been all I've been thinking about after reading this yesterday. Front page of the Wall Street Journal.
So this is
going to be
making
certain parts of the world that if I ran an airline, we would not fly over. We're going to deviate way around. That's where the transmitters are.
So, Temple, this is making me think of how. So, one of the differences that we know to be dramatic and probably very determinant in the autistic brain is how the sensory transmission, the senses essentially, they're hyper sensitive. There's no other way to put this.
Yes, I have problems with scratchy clothes. And when a child loud noises, I still don't like really loud noises. Now, some families have found that one of the ways to help a child not be so scared of loud noises like a hairdryer or a vacuum cleaner is let the child turn it on and off where they have control. And they might find the vacuum cleaner is fun to play with when they can control it.
And that makes perfect sense with what the neuroscience of sensory perception, because everything that we do generates sensory return, and every sensory return that we can predict is tuned down, it's dampened in processing when it's processed by the brain. So doing things yourself is a known, guaranteed way, like neuroscientifically
that's really interesting.
So everything that you do yourself is much more tolerable.
It's more tolerable. Now, I'm not going to be wearing scratchy wool against my skin.
No, and I have to have with you.
Soft clothes, t-shirts, and underwear against my skin that is soft. And the other thing I do is some of the pants have to be washed 3 times before they're soft enough for a long ride on an airplane.
So I have my days where and this is me wearing clothes that I own already. There are days where I come back to the bedroom 3 or 4 times to change my clothes. It's like, nope, I can't get out the door wearing this.
I'm not doing that because I've gotten clothes now where all the clothes I don't really like, that I really hate, I got rid of them. And then some of the Western shirts would be scratchy, but I wear a t-shirt under them. And that solves the problem.
We come up with our hacks.
This is what I do.
So I have this is 2 questions now already for you. The first one is, do you think that a lot of the ways that make us different are directly or indirectly, but they can still be traced back to sensory hypersensitivity?
Well, that's part of it, but it's not the whole thing. I also have a processing slowness. I cannot remember if somebody says, now this is how you do a hard reboot on a computer, 5 steps. I have to write it down. I have no working memory. I have to write the steps down. Because if my computer person just goes like this, I can't remember that.
But what's going on in your mind as somebody is explaining these 5 steps to you?
I can't follow the keystrokes. I simply do not have enough processor speed. I also cannot follow very rapid chit-chat conversation. I have problems with interrupting because my processor speed is slow. I know it's rude, but I cannot help it.
So that the way I've been thinking about that is that so if somebody is explaining something to me, or it usually happens it happens quite often that something is going on the outside. And if I'm stuck on the inside, just in my own head, in my own thoughts, it seems that I have an ability to shut off the world so completely from what's going on inside my head.
Well, I can, if I'm in a real noisy environment like the airport, I spend a lot of time in the airport. I have to be careful to not shut the announcements out. And so what I do when I'm waiting for a flight, I sit where I can see the boarding door. And one flight, I did not do that. I got on the plane, but I was late getting there.
So something that I've been working on recently is we discovered that so my colleagues have this habit of thinking that the neurons in the brain, they just demand energy and they get whatever energy they require. As if the amount of energy supplied to the brain were never limiting. What we found out is that it's the opposite. The brain works at the very limit of extracting all the oxygen that it can extract from whatever blood it's supplied with from the heart. And what that means is that if you think of your brain as a whole getting only so much energy, if this part of your brain gets more active, it is necessarily at the expense of something else in the brain. So, which is, to me, explains so many things, starting with attention, like you mentioned a working memory deficit. What if it's not exactly a working memory deficit? It's just that your attention is all the time elsewhere.
I can look right at the keyboard when Chris, my computer person, I cannot remember it. He says, you just do this. In fact, years ago, Nancy Minshew at the University of Pittsburgh gave me a thing called the finger windows test, which I failed very badly.
What is that?
And it would be, well, it's a pegboard, a bunch of pegs in it. And they go like this on a bunch of pegs. It would be similar to keystrokes on a computer.
Okay.
I could not remember them. I failed it.
That's interesting.
I absolutely failed. It's called the finger windows test. I completely failed it.
That's interesting.
I basically have got no working memory, so I have stapled to my bookshelf the 5 steps of the hard reboot for the computer, because I cannot remember the keystrokes. I write them down.
And yet you can do so many other things beautifully. So this is where I was going with this.
I
this
don't
idea
need working memory for the other things I do. Design work, that all comes out of long-term memory. Okay, right now I'm just obsessed with this airplane. I got like 4 million miles. And the fact that they could hack a plane's navigation system and make it go off course, very scary. So I'm going through a whole bunch of stuff. I went through like a website, all the different ways to harden the system. Some of them will work, some of them they'll figure out a way around it. And so I've been thinking about, well, what would I do? I think in some of these airports in certain parts of the world, we're going to have to go visual flight rules. If it's cloudy, the flights are canceled.
So it's your
because
way
visual
of
flight rules cannot be hacked. They can see where they're going. Then you can follow freeways, you can follow roads.
Yeah. So it's your way of handling that.
I'm thinking about it, and I'm going through. I'm going through the things we do, and there's a very scary diagram of how the little map you have, the flight path, got modified.
And Temple,
I was reading this yesterday and just about freaking out. I have a flight tomorrow, but I'm not worried about it because none of these transmitters that could hack it are in the North America. But
Temple,
right now, there's certain places where I would not go because I'm going to be too near transmitters that could compromise the navigation system of the airplane.
But that's
And
one
then-
way of fighting the anxiety. It's getting the information, right?
Well,
you're
getting the
informing
information I
yourself
found
and
with
thinking of how to
COVID,
control
one of
it.
the ways I dealt with my anxiety is I looked up all the treatments for COVID, all the drugs that supposedly don't work. I stockpiled them all. I spent hours on Google Scholar, hours and hours and hours. I was very careful not to get sick because I was 73 years old at the time. With my age, I looked at those statistics. But I don't like to talk about COVID stuff because of all the politics involved.
Yeah.
But I was pretty sure I could treat it. I am a good scientist when it comes to surfing the internet. I got very deep into the literature. I had all the stuff stockpiled, and I figured I could save myself. That made me less afraid.
When you have concerns like this particular topic about the airplanes, how hyper focused do you get, and how
I started going through it and finding out. You see, then my mind tends to look at basic principles. You have an active sensor or a passive sensor. If you put a camera in a plane for navigation, that's only going to work if you can see the ground with no clouds. Now, there is a type of camera that can see through the clouds. It's a radar, but that has to put out an active signal. Anything that puts out an active signal can be hacked. I'm trying to figure out a way it can't without an active signal. No, it's really bad. And they need to stop shutting down the old-fashioned VOR systems that are much more robust.
Yeah.
I was looking through all of that stuff. GPS is not a robust system. It's very fragile. And we better not get rid of all the old-fashioned navigation things that are much more robust, where if GPS goes totally down. Now, if GPS goes totally down, the pilot knows that. But what scares me is somehow they just make the plane slowly deviate off course. That's going to be less likely to detect that.
So that too is something that I've learned, that my best working definition of intelligence is flexibility, and anything that takes flexibility away, like what you're describing, that the idea of possibly removing beacons and other flights of navigation, it's just dumb on principle because it takes alternatives away.
Well, you see, the problem is when they made the VORs are expensive to maintain, but the problem is they had like too much faith in the GPS. Where I'm going, a bunch of satellites up there, weak signals, easy to hack.
So many ways for it to. Exactly.
It's a fragile system.
It is.
And the other thing is where they do this, fortunately, they can't do something across the Atlantic and do something to one of our airplanes. They have to, plane has to fly over it. But at 35,000 feet, they can mess around with the navigation system. Because I looked at one map there in the Wall Street Journal and said, well, that plane would have been at 35,000 feet at that time.
So, Temple, knowing everything that you've learned and been through, did you ever wonder what would you tell your 15-year-old self if you could? Would you what kind of advice
I would have told when I was 15, that was the worst part of my life. Bullied, teased. The only places I had friends, I had some friends through the shared interest of horseback riding. I had friends.
Yep.
And I would tell my 15-year-old self that when I became out of adolescence and became an adult, things would be better. That's what I would have told my 15-year-old self, because I had a horrible adolescence. Horrible.
I'm so happy to hear that. So I've been asked this question, and I figured the one thing I would tell my teenage self was exactly that: it gets better. It will get better.
It definitely got better. And you probably have read what I've in my book, Thinking in Pictures, my experiences with antidepressant medication.
I don't remember that part, but I did see you say that the other day in another interview. So I had that experience too. When I moved to the US, The whole process was incredibly stressful, and it costed me a chronic anxiety disorder.
Well, my nervous system was like the fear circuits in my brain were all ramped up. And I've looked at some of the literature on how certain sensory stimulation turns on fear circuits in the autistic brain that are not turned on, with just regular people. It's like the whole fear system is magnified. And any little thing I get stressed out over. In fact, I started keeping track of trips and stuff I did. There didn't seem to be much relationship between that and my panic attacks. And as I went through my 20s, they worsened, and worsened. And colitis problems I had, everything went through me. My health was totally deteriorated.
And then the antidepressants made a huge difference.
Yeah. I went on a low dose of imipramine, old-fashioned tricyclic. Mm-hmm. The colitis cleared up in 2 weeks.
Yep. That's how long it takes to act.
Then I switched to disipramine, and I've been on that for 40 years.
I'm glad to hear it gets better.
I don't know if I'd be alive if I hadn't gone on that medication. My health was so bad.
As a mother of a teenage son, I'm glad to hear that it gets better, because I think teenage years, at least in my experience, are being the most challenging part of my journey as a mother.
You're shoved out there with everybody else. The rules that you learned that applied at home in your small little world that it took you so long to figure out, all of a sudden they're not much good, because there's all these other things that make no sense. People don't speak their minds. People don't say what they mean. What they do say is completely different from what they actually wanted to say, and then they expect you to know the difference.
The other thing that bothers me is that human behavior, all the emotions and the stuff that people do to each other, wars and all that stuff, all the bad stuff people do. And, somewhere somebody wrote in some book I read that the human beings can be absolutely the kindest beings, but they can also be the most cruel. And in my book, Animals in Translation, I read accounts where teenage dolphins behaving extremely badly, the teenage chimpanzees beating up an old grandpa chimpanzee. And it seemed like the animals with the more complex brains were capable of some really nasty behavior.
That's what you get with more neurons in the cortex. So that's exactly my work. The more neurons you get in the cerebral cortex, the more flexible your behavior is. But that's for better and for worse.
Well, yeah, that's right.
I think this is the perfect cue for Gustavo to jump in, because he's a specialist in behavior. And he's been spending the last 17 years supporting and empowering individuals with autism and their families. Like my family, Gustavo met my child when he was 3, and now he's 13. So Gustavo, thank you so much for being here.
Is your child fully verbal now?
He is. He's fully verbal. He studies in a regular school. He has an incredible memory. It's unbelievable. But at this point, I don't know exactly what his talent is. So
what is he good at? What was his best subject in school?
He loves maps.
He loves math? Okay, well then maybe he needs to be moved ahead in math and given harder math. Because I've been hearing reports of really smart math kids in primary school being forced to do the same little elementary baby math over and over again, turn into gigantic behavior problems. He's really good at math. He may need to be moved ahead in math.
Yeah, and the memory as well is unbelievable. So I know that Gustavo has many questions as well. So Gustavo, I think it's the perfect cue for you to jump in. So far away. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Mari. I'm impressed by this historic conversation between these two incredible people. I see that you have a lot of content to exchange between yourselves. Okay? I hope this is the first step of many. Okay, great to be here, Ms. Grandin. It's a pleasure to speak with you again. I'm so happy. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's great to be here.
I have a few questions, and I'll try to get straight to the point, okay? My first question is, how do you see the evolution of therapeutic and medical interventions for autistic individuals? From the perspective of someone on this spectrum.
That's too general for me. I have to split it up into sections, like speech delay kids, early intervention. That was me. And then you get what they used to call Asperger's. I know that term's not used anymore. No speech delay, kind of socially awkward. And then you get the real severe ones where they have difficulty doing tasks like dressing themselves. See, this is where, so I've got to kind of know who we're talking about here. You know, for the speech delay kids like me, I was delayed until age 4, really good early intervention, and I got it. A lot of emphasis on speech, turn taking, and skills. And then you take the fully verbal, okay, there was no speech delay. You know, I had some very good people that coached me on social things. You know, when I did some rude stuff, they just explained to me exactly what I did wrong. You cannot
That's
be
what we
vague.
need.
Vagueness does not work. I criticized some welding on a job, my very first job, and I said it looked like a pigeon had doo-dooed on it. And the plant engineer pulled me into his office and he said, "You're going to have to apologize for that." And he made me go up to the cafeteria and apologize to the welder. He told me exactly what I had to do. It was the right thing to do. Perfect job, coach. Thank you, Harley. That's the name of the engineer. But the problem is autism is such a broad spectrum now. You know, I have my little kid stuff I'm going to talk about, and then let's look at all of them. There's one thing we need. I have no working memory. Let's say I worked at a store and I have to close out the cash register, and there's 5 steps. In the beginning, I would have to write them down. Absolutely have to write them down. I don't remember verbal speech sequence.
But that's the kind of coaching that's similar to the very explicit instructions that you got from your coach. And the difference is that this is written instructions that you give to yourself.
But the other thing is, I don't need let's say it's something like all right, let's just take kind of into airport stuff. We've talked about that. I got to learn how to be a gate agent. Well, and there's about 10 things I got to do on that computer, like print a boarding pass. Now, if somebody just goes like this, I can't follow that. I watched a gate agent trying to train another gate agent. She was getting kind of mad and going, "Well, you just do this." And then the ticket comes out. Now, what I would have to do is when they're not busy, write down the keystrokes for print a boarding pass. Write down the keystrokes for changing a seat. You know, there's only the few things a gate agent has to do. And write them down. And then I'd have to go home and memorize them. But then we have a problem at our Denver airport with frozen jet bridges. Because I'm going to feel pretty stupid that I couldn't remember those keystrokes. I'll fix the frozen jet bridges. Yeah, that's where my kind of thinking can excel. And they delay flights. I've been on them 45-minute delays with a frozen jet bridge that doesn't move.
Temple, I'm curious about the speech, let's just call it thing for now. Do you still find yourself going mute at times on occasions, just losing words? Never happens?
No, what happened with me, when the grown-ups talked fast, when I was a little kid, it went to gibberish. Well, they had to slow down to talk to me. The other thing, because of slow processor speed, you've got to give the kid time to respond. So you've got to give that kid more time to respond when you ask them to use their words. And I like to use the analogy, it's like a smartphone with 1 bar of service. Yeah. It takes time for it to respond. And people understand that analogy. I like real simple things that people can understand.
It takes time to process. So a colleague of mine here at Vanderbilt found out a few years ago that the window of time that it takes normal people to process sounds is very, very narrow. It's about 0.1 second. But when you look at people on the spectrum, that window is much broader. And what that means is that our brain jumbles together all the sounds that you hear within, say,
Well,
a
what
half
happens
second
is,
or more.
okay, you know, what happens is the word dog or cat. Dog becomes oh, cat becomes
Exactly.
ah. Because if you take that speech and put it through a sound analyzer, the consonants, like the cat, the C and the T, are quicker than the vowel. And so what was done with me is they'd say cat, or get me to say cup.
Separate the
Stretch it
sounds.
way out. Then I could hear it. You know, again, processor speed problems.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I give up processor speed, but then I have huge visual memory for different things, where there's other types of problem solving where a visual thinker can just see a solution to a problem. All right, let me just tell you a real simple one. It's another airport one. A mom is really upset because the airlines just lost her baby stroller. Well, I see her two kids on a bright blue Southwest Airlines wheelchair. Okay, you see, I just see it. It's a real simple example that people can relate to. And they're not little infants. They're not going to roll off. There's another kind of wheelchair at that airport I absolutely would not put them on because it doesn't have good sides. But that's an example of just seeing a solution to a problem.
Yeah, I think I do something similar in many, many ways. It's images. It's not words. Although
there are no words. The image just popped into my head. And
exactly. I see full diagrams.
Wheelchair that Southwest Airlines had.
Yeah. And Temple, I think this brings us to something very important to young adults within the spectrum, which is workplace adaptations, right? And how we should
that's where we
go. So I think Gustavo has a question from one of the people that we talked about the other day. So Gustavo, I think you have a question about this.
Take advantage of your comment. In your opinion, Ms. Grandin, what are the most essential workplace adaptations that companies should implement to create more inclusive and effective environment to neurodivergent employees?
All right, let's go. Two things. I want to prepare the autistic adult for the workplace, and then I'll talk a little bit what employers can do. First thing, they've got to learn how to do a task on a schedule outside the family. And when I talk to grandfathers and grandmothers that find out they're autistic later in life, they've all got good jobs because they had paper routes when they were 11. Now, I know that's gone. But then they could do something like a church volunteer job. I talked to a 12-year-old, so proud that she's a church's coffee lady. That's an example of teaching a work skill costs nothing to implement. They've got to learn the work skill. That coffee's got to be done right. And it's a job. And we need to be doing more of those kinds of things because I'm seeing students on the spectrum graduate with honors from college and not be able to handle the workplace. We need to start having a gradual transition from school to work. Let's start with being on time. If you watch the HBO movie, the boss was very adamant about hygiene issues. Clean it up, period. That one's non-negotiable.
Yep.
And being on time was pounded into me, so that was never an issue. Driving took me a lot longer to learn. Gonna have to do more time, more practice in totally safe places. Show you what I learned to drive on. That's what I learned to drive on. Manual shift.
Remember from that movie.
That's my truck right there. But they're not learning work skills. I see too many parents. Well, their 16-year-old good students never gone shopping by themselves. They're not learning basic skills. Having a bank account. Just these basic kind of skills they're getting too overprotected. And I think that's a very big problem. Now, what employers can do on checklists. Okay. Now, when I worked in a dairy, this is something my employer did, which was the Arizona State University farm. They did it for all the students. there was a checklist on the wall of how to set up and clean the milking equipment. I was so lucky that was there. Now, that's an example of universal design.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you.
I mean, very, very simple thing. Also, I think the autistic person needs to learn to ask. Okay, they're showing them how to log onto the cash register. And then the autistic person needs to say, let me just write it down. To just say, just to learn to make their own checklist. I did that. I did that for lots of different things. The other place where people are losing jobs is they'll say something vague like you're rude with customers, but there's not enough specificity.
Right.
The feedback is too vague, and then they finally fire them. I'm seeing that happening a lot. You see what was done right with me when I said the welding looked like pigeon do. The plant engineer pulled me into his office. He was an older guy in his 50s, and he told me exactly what I had to do. And he didn't yell at me. It was done in private, really quietly. I had to go up to that cafeteria and apologize.
Very interesting.
I think the main hurdle to get to that point is exactly is becoming aware that those things are even issues to begin with.
Well, the thing is, I wasn't aware. I almost lost a job. Changing bosses, super dangerous time. I was working for the Farmer Ranchman magazine, and there was that scene in the movie where I got the card because I knew working for that magazine would help my career. Then we got a new boss because the magazine was sold, and the new boss thought I was totally weird. Now, one of the problems at the magazine was that many of the articles I had written did not have bylines. So the boss could not look at the articles and see all the stuff that I had written. But Susie, the lady who did the advertising layout, she saw the warning sign. She says, Jim doesn't like you. We're going to have to get a big scrapbook of all of your articles. And then he gave me a raise. But changing bosses, that's where a lot of people that have been successful maybe for years on a job lose a job.
New bosses come with new rules. So where I was getting at is that in the workplace, I think it helps enormously when people realize that we may not be aware of the disconnect, and instead of just, so it's more than simply saying, oh, we need explicit, detailed feedback. It's we need the explicit, detailed feedback because it doesn't come automatically us to realize that you might perceive something that I say as other than just a simple statement of fact. And I think a lot of what gets perceived as rudeness is just that. It's right. It's a statement of fact because that's how we think.
Well, when I was younger, I was at the University of Illinois in the I was in my 30s. I didn't say hi in the corridor, and other professors thought I was rude, and I didn't realize that was rude. And then somebody said to me, "Well, you need to say hi to people in the corridor." So I started doing that. Okay,
Temple,
that's just a simple example.
When I moved to Nashville 8 years ago, I had to learn that the custom here in Nashville is that when people meet you and say, "Hi, how are you doing?" they expect a full answer. It's not the New York thing of saying, "Hi, could I get a decaf, please?" It's not. No, there's a whole transaction that needs to there's a whole back and forth that needs to go on first, where it goes, "Hey, how are you doing today?" You have to reply, "I'm doing great. How are you?" So that was a learning process of several months.
Yep, and I would agree with that. And these things can be taught. And one of the things I think helped the grandparents, who would be the Asperger type, where there was no speech delay, keeping their jobs, is in our generation, social skills were taught to all children in a much more structured way.
Yeah.
You know, I was cue when I forgot to say thank you or please, mother would go, you forgot to say. She'd cue me.
I think that comes together with these small jobs and chores that kids used to have to do, right? Because when you have a small chore like delivering the paper, you're forced to meet people in this highly restricted, highly ordered, organized way, which is incredibly helpful. It's really like I think what you normal people out there don't understand is that you work amongst yourselves because you share the same set of assumptions about what people think and how people work and what people mean when they actually mean when they say something. I think we make no assumptions. We operate on what we're actually told.
Well, that's just it. You see, this whole thing about, you know, the sort of emotional stuff behind things, where the things I've been very good at in my career is designing facilities, solving problems. Like this whole airplane thing. Yep, I'm really hung up on that right now. And I'm thinking, well, what do I do if I ran an airline? Yeah, there's certain parts of the world we only fly visual flight rules. We go over it. There's clouds. Don't land. Don't go there. Because you can't hack visual flight rules. I just thought of that. So I could fly there, but you got to be able to see the ground.
And Temple, I think one of the things that social skills, we were talking, Gustavo and I, just the other day about the role of technology, right, Gustavo?
Right.
Well,
yeah. Bring it back the other question. One minute, Maddie. Thinking about strategies and tools to have proven helped to manage sensory sensitives. Thinking about employees, for example, we don't have in our country, but around the world, I've seen the concept of sensory friendly places that we have that machine decibel meters, sound mufflers, you know, thinking about environment adaptations. Thinking
well,
about
the other thing that I
what do you
talk about
suggest?
in a lot of my talks, I mean, I worked with a lot of construction stuff and engineering stuff. And I tell business leaders, we need the autistic brains. We need the visual thinkers to invent mechanical devices. We need the mathematical thinkers. And you look at some famous scientists, physicists. Einstein was autistic, no speech till age 3. I worked with people that had multiple patents for mechanical devices. They were undiagnosed autistics, owning big metal working shops. See, this is something that a lot of people that are in therapy and psychology, they don't understand the industrial world. I've been out to the computer companies. Half those programmers are on the spectrum. We wouldn't have Zoom without autistic brains being involved in it. You know, we need the brains that are more interested in interesting stuff they do.
So there's I saw a change happen recently over the last 5 years or so. There was a lot of talk in the US when I moved here 8 years ago. There was still a lot of talk about funding autism research to cure and eradicate autism. That has completely disappeared.
Well,
and
the problem is if you did that, you wouldn't have you can like eliminate just about all
exactly. No, it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea to begin with.
The thing is, no, you absolutely don't want to cure it. No, I would agree with that.
But the beautiful thing is that has effectively disappeared, I think, from the autism research community, and I think that comes from advocates, from advocacy, from people like you and me too, just speaking up and saying, look, we just work differently. We're mentally left-handed, but we have our contribution too.
Susanna, what amazes me, sorry to interrupt you, but what amazes me is like I have a cousin who has a farm in the countryside of Brazil, very, very far away from São Paulo, Rio, all the big cities. And she does have in her farm a curved cattle chute, you know, one of Temple's inventions. So how amazing this is, you know, and I'm so proud every time I go there and I look at it and I remember you, Temple, and I see, you know, how big the world is and how big the opportunities are for brilliant autistic minds, and how prepared we should be, you know, to embrace this different way of thinking.
Well,
and that too is where I think this left-handed, mentally left-handed notion comes in handy too, because it's the same. It's it's the same approach as we had with left-handedness, actual left-handedness. It got suppressed. It got literally beaten out of children decades ago. But what happens once you embrace it and once you acknowledge that it's just a different way of doing things? And yes, maybe it takes a little bit of flexibility on the majority part to provide accommodations. But providing accommodations is something that is essentially being kind. It's one of those things that we, with all our cortical neurons, we know how to do that. We know how to be kind if we choose to. And acknowledging diversity, acknowledging autism as one maybe more extreme kind of diversity, it shouldn't be that difficult. It shouldn't be any more than that. Just acknowledging that people work in different ways, that yes, let's accommodate them because we can. And what can you do to accommodate? You just need awareness. You just need to raise awareness.
This is talking about it way too broad, because I've been doing these talks for a long time. And the accommodations, let's say at the university, for example, extra time on tests. Yeah, that's a real common one that's needed. And the other thing is not being able to follow these long strings of verbal information. Now, there's a lot of situations where the autistic person needs to be taught to make the checklist. So I would just say, let me write down the steps for logging onto the cash register. Let me just write them down. And the other thing is a problem with certain LED lights that flicker. And that's a problem for some people on the autism spectrum, but also for head injuries and for some dyslexics and ADHD. And let's get lights that don't flicker. There's 20% of your employees are going to thank you probably for that. Those are the most common things. But I have students with autism come up to me and they said, well, they didn't give me accommodations. And I said, let's discuss specifically what you need. Because when you just put this big blanket statement out to employers and out that, well, and I'm finding in most cases, and I'm a professor, I've got an autistic student in my class right now, extra time on tests. Okay, fine. Even if they don't use it, they can relax knowing that they have it. And then the checklist stuff. Those are two most common ones that are very easy to do.
Yeah, but see, this is what I mean by self-awareness here, is that sometimes the student who has the difficulties is not even aware of where their difficulties come from. And that's where it gets really hard, because how do you help somebody without first understanding what is the source of the problem that requires the help? And that's a tough one.
What's a big problem with students now. When I went to school and I failed my first math quiz, I had to be tutored everything in math. I went to the professor, I asked for help. What I'm finding now, especially in the last 5 years, especially since COVID, students don't ask for help.
Interesting.
This is something I'm finding more relatively recently.
Is that a cultural thing, maybe? That
no, it didn't used to be that way. I'm talking about in the U.S. It didn't used to be that way.
No, that's what I meant, actually, that something changed in the culture, that now it's a bad thing to ask for help.
They're not used to talking to people, doing everything on the phones. I think that tends to make things worse. But I've got students right now where they're doing badly in my class, one that's cut a whole bunch of classes. We've reached out to them, we've emailed them. They're not responding.
Temple, out of curiosity, do you like talking on the phone?
Actually, I liked talking on the phone very much, and that's how I used to sell jobs, because I didn't have to deal with all the facial expressions and stuff like that. I didn't really understand. I found the phone was my friend. I used to cold
That's
call
so interesting.
beef plants, and I'd go, engineering office, please. And they say, that's Mr. Jones. I tried to get the direct line extension, and I said, I see you're doing remodeling your plant. I'd like to send you my brochure on cattle handling facilities. I sold the jobs doing that. What I learned was to sell my skill rather than myself. I would show off my drawings.
Brilliant.
And then I'd send a drawing like this in the mail as a big fold-out drawing to the plant engineer along with some pictures. No, I found the phone was my friend. I was a master at using.
That's interesting. I hate phone calls, but that's because that's for a completely different reason. First, I have a very hard time parsing out the language without seeing the face, the lips move in front of me. Yeah. I
never got many cues from the face.
This situation is more comfortable for you, right?
Yeah, and also my there's also the part where now that we have a text alternative, I love text. Text gives you time to think, gives you time to respond, like Temple was saying. Also, I have a chance to edit what I wrote, and if I say it like this, this is going to sound rude, so let me edit this. And But the other thing too is that I guess that the type of phone call that you were doing was different, where if you're selling something, it's a much more structured conversation. The idea of having to go through the chit chat on the small talk on the phone in the beginning of a phone call, that's paralyzing to me. It's like, I don't know how to do this. I don't want to handle this. At least if you're there in person, there's other cues that could give you an idea of something to talk about.
This is very interesting. You see, I never got the other cues. And so I found the phone was my friend.
We've been talking about technology, social skills. Yeah. I got one question, right? Looking forward to the future, how do you believe, Ms. Grandin, technology will evolve to help autistic individuals develop a wide range of skills, including social skills? Today we have people using AI, chat, and always get good performances feedback.
So essentially you're asking what types of technology are our friends.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's my curiosity as well.
Yeah.
Well, I'll go first then. I think text is a beautiful thing. The fact that we have an opportunity to, like Temple was saying, to slow down the conversation, that you can answer on your own time, even email. And I think it's on us to educate the people on the other side that I do not have to reply immediately just because I have to, because I can. I don't have to just because I can. And to me, that's the beauty of text. I find voice messages, people who on Brazilians use WhatsApp a lot.
Oh, yeah.
And some people have this thing of sending voice messages. I refuse to listen to a single one. I find them incredibly intrusive, that people expect you to listen to their voice in the middle of nowhere, in the midst of other people. It's like, just text me, give me something that I can read quietly without bothering people, and I can do it on my own time. So I think that anything technology related that has to do with slowing things down, with giving us more opportunities, with providing us with cues, providing us with time, with alternatives, with other way of looking at things, of accessing information, all of that is incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I'm a bit conscious of time, but I would like to ask you both a question, because many of the features that you described of being common within the people on the spectrum is also found in other neurodivergent people. For example, I have ADHD, right? And I I can relate to many of these things. So my question to you, Susanna, is from a neuroscience perspective, this gray area between, autism, ADHD, and other neurodivergencies. So how does neuroscience explain that? What's the line that, divides us all, or are we all neurodivergent in a way or another?
Oh God, that's one of the most annoying things that I hear people say, that everybody is a little bit autistic, everybody is a little bit ADHD. That is such, I'm trying really hard to not say bad words here. That's exactly that's why we need the spectrum word. It's actually, let me take that back. These are constellations of features, and being sensitive to scratchy clothing does not make anybody autistic, does not mean that everybody is a little bit autistic. What makes you autistic is that you have all of these features at the same time, forming a pattern. That's what a constellation is. A constellation is a pattern. So people
could be only sensory disorder, only this sensory sensitivities could be only sensory disorder.
There is an analogy that I read once, which I related quite a lot. It was basically like the fact that you run and you are out of breath doesn't mean you are asthmatic. So having asthma is being out of breath for your whole life. It's living like that. It's not like one episode. So I think neurodivergency can be also described.
Yeah, but there's a huge difference between. So your example doesn't capture the fact that it is that on multiple fronts at the same time. It's not one single feature that makes anybody autistic. It's not one way of being different from everybody else. Everybody is different from everybody else. The thing is that there's a group of people out there that share the extreme version of the dial on multiple dials at the same time. And that is a pattern that can be recognized. And the interesting question to me from the neuroscience point of view is, how does it get there? And that's where, coming back to my image of the brain having to make do with there's only so much energy. I think that when you have these patterns of sensory hypersensitivity, that drives away, that takes energy, literally, away from other systems in the brain. And if that happens while they're forming, while they're being shaped, you're going to end up with a brain that just functions in a very completely different way from how other people's brains function.
I'd like to talk about how I look at this, and I'm sorry about the interrupting. This is where
please.
When everyone says everybody's a little bit autistic, I agree that is wrong. But the way I look at it is, especially since you can be more cognitive, where you're just interested in sort of what you do. Like, I find certain things with problem solving extremely interesting, whether it's COVID or whether it's aviation, or whether it's problems with the thrusters on the Starliner spaceship, which I've also completely researched. I find those things extremely interesting. So it's more cognitive rather than social emotional. Then the other half of the population would be more social emotional. In other words, the things that they do, the social emotional part is much more important. So what I've said is half the population of the world might be a little bit autistic and goes towards being more cognitive rather than social emotional. And the other half of the world is more social emotional, because with me, I find the most interesting stuff. Like, I was on a flight one time and I talked to a lady construction superintendent. We had a great 2.5-hour flight discussing concrete bridge forming systems. Now, that's a good flight. That's the kind of stuff I find very, very interesting. I was looking at a building that was being torn down just the other day, and they made a mistake. I saw it just the other day, and they busted something they shouldn't have busted in the adjacent building. Those are the kind of things that I notice. I also find that stuff extremely interesting, much more interesting than emotions. Now, I can sometimes get laughing about something that's just completely stupid, but just figuring things out. I have some of my best friends, we would discuss animal behavior, or we would discuss equipment problems and how to fix them. And those were some of the greatest times I ever had, was talking about how to make some mechanical device work at the plant.
Yep.
That stuff I find very, very interesting.
And see, that's diversity. That's the beauty of diversity. Life is whatever works. There's I get a lot of these comments on, oh, things have to exist for a reason because evolution only selects the best, the most. No, that is so wrong. It's as long as you have a system that works, that's functional, you're fine. That's what life is about, and that is what evolution is. It's just a story of change over time. There's nothing. You don't need to find an advantage in this or that, in schizophrenia or attention deficit or autism to explain how come it exists. It exists, period. Now let's talk about how that diversity is actually interesting and can be a good thing, even when it's the absolute tiny minority that then has a hard time functioning in the world that's created by and for the majority.
That made my life worthwhile is having an interesting career. And so I'm very much career oriented, and students get interested in things they get exposed to. I didn't get exposed to the cattle industry until I was a teenager.
But you had that opportunity.
Exposed to musical instruments, I was horrible at them. Another kid, especially the math type autistic, can take off with musical instruments. And so I want to expose kids to lots of interesting stuff, see what they kind of gravitate towards, and where they can get into a good career. I've had parents, when they finally got their kid out on a job that they really liked, they said he became an adult. She grew up. She blossomed. They bloomed. I'm hearing those kind of comments. And I'm thinking right now, I'm 77 years old. And so one of the big things I'm working on now is trying to help individuals on the autism spectrum to get into really good careers. I do a lot of talks to business people, and we have a skill loss issue with visual thinking. I just went to a conference on hay harvesting equipment. Hay, like cattle and horses eat that. The top companies are from Europe. And it goes back to where our visual thinkers like me playing video games when we should be designing mechanical devices. And then you have mathematics kids that aren't being developed. You know, they need to go work on artificial intelligence. But we've got kids where they're not getting exposed to enough stuff. And I'm very definitely, I am what I do. And
I completely agree.
You're probably sick and tired of hearing me talk about this airplane issue. Yes, I'm concerned. I'm not concerned about it in North America. Those transmitters are not in North America. And so I'm not worried about my flight to Canada tomorrow. But there's some places I would not fly over right now. We'll leave out where they are.
Well, hopefully Brazil is still on your list.
No,
hopefully.
Brazil would still be on my list. Yes.
Yay.
None of it. You see, it's a transmitter on the ground that messes up the airplane, and that's where you don't want to fly over it. But I also find it very interesting. Like, okay, if I was the head of an airline, what am I going to do about this? You see, like, I'm very
clearly
interested in
have to
how
talk to you.
policy gets made about technical things. And we've got people making policy now. They don't know nothing about it.
So we need those people. So I'd like to say one last thing. I think you guys are talking about what to do, and I think every parent's role is to provide opportunities for their kids, and I think the parents of kids on the spectrum is their role is no different. It's that on steroids. It's kids on the spectrum really, really need opportunities and a range of different opportunities.
Oh, I would agree with that.
It's particularly important for them to be able to find what it is that works for them, what it is that tickles your fancy,
on the other hand,
that really captivates you.
Kids that are so addicted to video games, they're not going anywhere. They're not going to get a job in that industry. They just had massive layoffs. Artificial intelligence is going to kill the jobs in the video game industry. But you know what works? Get your video game addicts off? Auto mechanics. I've talked to 5 or 6 young adults that did that, and they found the motors were more interesting, and they're out in jobs they really like.
Yeah,
okay, that's the kind of stuff right now that I get really interested in.
I think this is a great way to wrap up our conversation today with this message that we should, embrace diversity, offer opportunities, and being aware of the beauty of having different minds. I think that's the main message of today's talk. I know we extrapolated our time, so I appreciate you, Temple and Susanna, to be here. I could talk to you the whole day.
Well, I think the other thing that's interesting is sort of the different approaches that we both come from. I come from a very techie approach. I'm really interested in mechanical stuff, interested in a lot of technical things, and there's different approaches. Things that are strictly social emotional, I find boring.
Brilliant.
I don't know. I used to watch all the James Bond movies when I was a kid, and I wanted to look at the gadgets that they had. Yeah, the Aston Martin car and all the gadgets.
I think
I really like that kind of stuff.
I think it's very interesting that we are all in different areas, but in a way we all have our role in this world. Like as a communicator as well, awareness is extremely important, not only for the general community but also within the companies. So neuroscience, I don't even have to say, the importance of it. You, Temple, you are a guide to all of us.
Well, I just want to see these individuals get into really great jobs, because some of the funnest stuff I ever had was sitting around with another autistic equipment designer, and we were discussing how we were going to build something. That was some of the best times I ever had.
Amazing.
Happens at the soft sciences conferences too.
Okay, so you get the same thing out of science conferences, out of
absolutely
conferences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, my PhD was in neuroscience. I work in construction and animal behavior, and I actually have a PhD thesis in neuroscience. So I took a bunch of neuroscience classes. And this book certainly got kind of neuroscience oriented.
That's my favorite one.
Yeah, I got to look into that one.
I have to say, it just blew my mind when I found out I had that gigantic visual thinking circuit in my brain.
Makes sense.
I looked at those, those brain scans, and I'm going, wow.
I remember that image. And well, thank you so much for being here. This conversation was priceless. Thank you, everyone who's been watching us for this hour and a half. And of course, I believe, Temple, this is not going to be the last time that we talk. So we just have to wait 4 more years. Let's try to have more regular conversations.
You know where I'm headed right now? I'm headed to a class in sustainability. And I'm going to recommend, I'm taking over some of my issues of science and nature, and I'm going to give them to the students there. I'm going to recommend that they read these magazines. You're going to be making policy about sustainability, water use, all of these kinds of things. You need to be reading science and nature.
That's, by the way, my specialty. I work in communications within the sustainability world. So you're speaking my language now.
Well, there's
so
a lot of stuff they did that's not, here's the ultimate not sustainable. You cut trees down in the United States. You chip them into pellets. You make pellets out of them. You put the pellets on a boat that's powered with petroleum, and then you burn those pellets in a power plant in the UK. They were doing that for 5 years. It was absolutely not sustainable. It finally went broke. I was going, how could somebody think that that was sustainable? That was
I think they were not thinking. That's the problem. They were not thinking.
Well, I think part of it, she's a visual thinker. I visualized that, they originally said, well, it's just going to be waste leftovers from sawmills. I could immediately visualize there's not enough leftovers. So the only way to fill the orders for pellets is to cut down trees, which instantly goes to not sustainable.
Exactly. That's
what it was atrocious.
Yeah, all the hard to abate sectors need to transition right now. Otherwise, there will be no future for our kids, our grandkids. So so let's see what these guys, the policymakers, will come up with. But in the meantime, let's keep fighting the good fight in all these areas. Thank you so much, Dr. Temple, Dr. Susan Herculano-Rosell, Gustavo. Thank you so much for everything. And hopefully we'll speak again pretty soon.
Okay, thank you so much. It
My
was
pleasure.
great talking to everybody.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you, Temple.
Thank you.
Good to
Bye-bye,
talk to you.
everybody.